The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, welcome everyone. I'd like to introduce Melissa Van Sickle, who is chair of our ethics committee.
Hi everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining. My name is Melissa Van Sickle, and I'm in our Nelson Mullins, Tallahassee, Florida office. Before we start, I wanted to make a few quick housekeeping comments. Immediately following this presentation, you will receive an email from us with a survey link. Please complete this very short survey to confirm your attendance, as this will assist us with CLE credits. Additionally, our speaker today will give you 2 code words during the presentation that you'll be asked to enter on the survey at the end of the presentation, just to prove that you are in attendance. He'll be clear about what these code words are though, so don't worry. And for those of you that might be wondering, we do this because some of our state bar associations require this in order to award CLE credit. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Ben Mitrani, who's on the litigation team in the Miami office, who will introduce our speaker. I think you'll really enjoy today's program, so thank you again for attending.
Thank you, Melissa. Hello, my name is Ben Mitrani. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Scott Rogers. Scott Rogers, MSJD, is founder of the University of Miami's School of Law's Mindfulness and Law program and co-founder of the university's Mindfulness Research and Practice Initiative, where he collaborates on neuroscience research on mindfulness training programs. Professor Rogers is a nationally recognized leader in the field of mindfulness. Since 1999, Professor Rogers has taught mindfulness to thousands of legal professionals, including lawyers, judges, law students, and law faculty, and to groups as far-ranging as physicians, parents, pilots, firefighters, accountants, athletes, business leaders, financial advisors, therapists, educators, and all of us. He is the recipient of numerous awards for his service to the legal profession and is author of 5 books on mindfulness. Professor Rogers lectures across the country, speaking at law and scientific conferences, and has been interviewed in newspapers and magazines for his work on mindfulness. Professor Rogers' work at the University of Miami School of Law has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, and his scientific research has been written about in the New York Times. I had the pleasure of taking Professor Rogers' Mindfulness and Law class while at the University of Miami School of Law. In class, we learned about focusing our attention on our breath and not as our thoughts as they race throughout the day. We also taught about the importance of being mindful of our external environment. I was privileged to take his class, and I even wrote a paper about using mindfulness in cross-examination and direct examination, and I hope to use mindfulness tactics in trial in the future. I'll make a brief note that we will have an opportunity for a question and answers during this program. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and I'll make sure Scott sees them. Professor Rogers, thank you very much.
Ben, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here with you all. Thank you, Melissa, for getting this whole thing in motion. And Ben, thank you for that very thoughtful introduction and for really being an extraordinary member of our profession from the moment I met you on. And also, I know that there are those of you out there that I know, and probably those of you out there that I know that I don't know. And so I'm really happy to be together to have this opportunity to explore this thing called mindfulness. And I'm interested in questions that you may have. So there'll be information, and I'll do my best to impart this in a way that's helpful and informative, and we'll do a little practice, and we'll consider some insights around mindfulness and connecting it to the practice of law. And in particular, we will have it where the theme is, I want to share. Okay, you all can see. To have it where we explore mindfulness as it relates to fundamentals to the practice of law and to life, like ethics and substance abuse and mental health, and those will all be sort of flow through this conversation, but the conversation will be larger than that. It will be about mindfulness and what mindfulness is and what mindfulness practices are. And there's a difference there between this thing called mindfulness and this thing called mindfulness, these things called mindfulness practices. And we'll touch on what that distinction is, because for many, and I'm assuming that some of you are very familiar with mindfulness, and some of you are not at all familiar with it. And so I'll try to address this and share this in a way that if you're brand new, you'll be like, ah, and you'll walk away with a sense of what this thing called mindfulness and these mindfulness practices are. And if you've been exploring mindfulness for a long time, that it'll offer you something to reflect on and perhaps to further deepen your relationship to this fascinating and important area, because it does relate to our ethical behavior and our professionalism and the ways we interact with each other, and really support the fabric of the law as it supports society. And also with substance abuse and mental health considerations that are just quite considerable. And regardless of, I think, where we find ourselves personally, because of our life circumstance, because of the fortuity or lack thereof of our conditioning, and just sort of the environments we find ourselves in, we all know what it is to have moods that go up and down, and to feel anxious and worried and concerned. We all know these in one form or another. So while this will be a big picture look at mindfulness and its connection to the law and the way it zeroes in on these ethical considerations that are so important, it'll also be very practical, and you'll be able to apply it in aspects of your life personally and professionally that are broader. And so, when we talk about mindfulness and law, some of you might be of the mind or of the sense that this is a new thing. But it was back in 2002, 20 years ago, just to give you a sense of the history, that at Harvard, at the Harvard Negotiation Law Review, that they had a symposium on mindfulness and law. So in fact, while some people sometimes say to me, more 15 years ago than today, oh, the mindful lawyer, that's an oxymoron, or oh, mindful, like there's something about that that's inconsistent. To the contrary, the law and the legal profession was actually relatively early in the game of considering the importance of mindfulness to the work that we do as lawyers and as members of the legal profession, and to our lives more broadly. And so I share this with you because Leonard Riskin is a very important scholar in this area. He wrote the lead piece called The Contemplative Lawyer, on the potential contributions of mindfulness meditation. And by the way, make note of that, because the putting together of those two words, mindfulness and meditation, begs an interesting question. Is mindfulness meditation, or is a mindfulness practice meditation? And we'll touch on that too a little bit. But the contributions, and he says the potential contributions. So we're setting expectations here, I think, responsibly to law students, lawyers, and to their clients. Now, Ben mentioned that some of the work that we've done has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal and other notable periodicals, have been writing about mindfulness in the business context and the legal context. And also, for those of us who are in Florida in particular, the Florida Bar has made great strides introducing mindfulness and well-being in many forms to the members of our profession. This is an issue from 2016. Wherever you are in the country, you may find it of interest to check out the spring issue, or I think the April issue of the Florida Bar Journal, which was all about mindfulness. Numerous articles written by various people on mindfulness as it relates to different aspects of the life of the lawyer and the legal professional. And then GP Solo, a publication of the American Bar Association, just a year and a half ago, devoted an entire issue to mindfulness and lawyer well-being. And I believe that one of the readings that you all have that was part of the CLE program is the lead piece from the GP Solo magazine, but the entire issue is important in this regard. But this is just a way of saying that this isn't new. In fact, this has been around for quite a while. Not only has mindfulness been around for a very long time, but mindfulness and law has been around now for upwards to 20 years. But why do we know about mindfulness? Probably not because of the way mindfulness has been talked about in the legal profession, though perhaps that is. Maybe you just heard about it when Nelson Mullins was, setting up this opportunity for us to explore this topic together. But there are corporations, large and small, in various sectors that have done a lot to bring mindfulness to its teams. We've got mindfulness in sports, and there's a whole lot to be said about that. We've got mindfulness in medicine at the bottom left with a magazine called Mindful, and perhaps some of you are aware of this magazine that's been out now for about 4 or 5 years on all things mindful. We've also got mindfulness in law firms, and I'll look forward to putting Nelson Mullins up here for one of the next iterations of this particular slide, but Berger Singerman has played a very significant role, and Paul Singerman in particular, sharing mindfulness with the legal profession. And in addition to the Florida Bar and the ABA judges, it's a very interesting thing to hear Justice Breyer talk about his daily meditative practice, which is of a mindfulness variety. Mindfulness in the military, a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the neuroscience research is looking at mindfulness and bringing it into the military in ways that can be important for mental health and well-being, as well as perhaps being able to rise to the top of one's game in terms of not making mistakes, right? And to be able to be responsible. And of course, this translates into the law as well, where we have such an important responsibility to be professional and ethical in our conduct with each other, with the bar. And then at the bottom right, I share this with you because you might find this of interest. If you're not familiar with it, that's Dan Harris. He's an ABC News correspondent. He's the host of Nightline and Good Morning America on Saturdays. He wrote a book known as 10% Happier, called 10% Happier. And then he wrote another book, and I want to just mention these to you because as we have the summer coming upon us, if you're not familiar with these books, you may find one or both of them to be a fun, easy, and important read. 10% Happier, the first one on the left, was a big New York Times bestseller. And the subtitle is important. It's How I Tamed the Voice in My Head. And some of you may know, Ben's talked about the thoughts that we have in the meandering mind. How I tamed the voice in my head, reduced stress, it's probably of many of our minds, without losing my edge. And so that's really, I think, fundamental to our conversation today. How we can have greater mastery over the activity of the mind, because it's so fundamental to the work that we do. It can serve us so well, it can get in the way. To reduce stress, to be more sort of centered, balanced, at ease, even in the midst of a tumultuous time, without losing our edge. And that's a balance that I think mindfulness practices serve us well at. And then the second book he wrote with a colleague of his is Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics. And the first book, 10% Happier, is really funny, really interesting, and really a well-done story of his journey and how he came to find mindfulness to be the thing that really worked for him, in large measure because of the science and his own direct experience with it. But people read it and said, this is a great book, Dan, but I need more actionable nuts and bolts things to do. So he came out with Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics. And as the title suggests, and maybe as many of us in the law sort of present ourselves as, we're skeptical and we're interested, but we want to sort of know what to do and we want to see results. And I think you'll find that that book and many other resources that I can touch on later on will serve us in that regard. The very last thing on this slide, just to give this big picture view, is an article from a Scientific American Mind. It's a journal. Now the lead piece on that was written by my colleague, Amishi Jha. She's the cognitive neuroscientist that we've been collaborating on neuroscience research for the better part of the last 11 or 12 years. And notice how it's sharpened the focus. So here it is. This is an article on mindfulness, the lead piece that she wrote, in Scientific American Mind. And the focus isn't relax with mindfulness. It's sharpen your focus, how the science of mindfulness can improve your attention and lift your mood. And today we'll talk a little bit about attention because it's so fundamental to this project of mindfulness and cultivating greater focus. So with that, I want to share with you, because another reading that you might find of interest, it's not one that I'm going to be spending really any time on, is a book that just came out about within the last year called Breath: The New Science of a Lost Art by James Nestor. It's a great book. I strongly encourage it. It's all about relaxation and cultivating a more steady state and resilience, using the breath as a vehicle for doing so. Now, that's not mindfulness. I mean, we can talk about how we can be mindfully aware of the ways that we use the breath, but this is a book on breathing. And but here's what he says in the book. He says that a wealth of scientific research, and I'll point you to some of that research in a moment, just so you can have a sense of this, shows that meditation can change the structure and function of critical areas of the brain, help relieve anxieties, and boost focus and compassion. Okay, so that's Probably something that's not new to most of you, this idea. But take note, this mindfulness meditation, and that's what he's referring to in particular here, changes the structure and function of the brain. So in a little bit, in about 7 minutes or so, we're going to be doing a little practice where I'm going to say lower or close your eyes, something that's probably familiar to you, something that you've probably done before or heard before. And we'll begin to facilitate a shift to a more grounded, steady, attentive state. That can change the structure and function of critical areas of the brain. That can help relieve anxieties. That can help boost focus and compassion. But then he says this, and this is what has me so interested in sharing mindfulness with you and with members of the profession, and why I'm interested in it myself, but in terms of trying to share it in ways that have traction. He says this. He says, it can work wonders, but few of us will ever reap these rewards because the vast majority of people who try to meditate will give up and move on. So these two paragraphs, one juxtaposed against each other, to me really is a clarion call for let's figure this thing out together, everyone. So at least if it has resonance for you, you don't give up and move on because of something about it. And I think the something about it is oftentimes that the way it's explained, what we think it is, there's a misunderstanding, and that misunderstanding can get in the way of its utility. And I hope that together today, some of that is clarified for you. So a roadmap of sort of where we are, where we're going. We've just sort of taken a big picture look at mindfulness in law and mindfulness in society and popular culture, perhaps. So we're going to zero in on what mindfulness is from a couple of different perspectives. We're going to talk about the science of mindfulness, just enough so you can go, oh, that's interesting. And if you want to follow up, you can follow up. We're going to then zero a little bit in on attention. Oh, by the way, your first attendance code, attention. It's one of the key pieces of our exploration today. And so if you remember nothing else, remember this, attention, it matters. It matters for our capacity to do our job well and to be well doing our job. And it matters in terms of getting your CLE. We'll also explore practices, mindfulness practices, and then some takeaway tips. And as it relates to those practices, we're not going to wait 4 layers down. We're going to weave that practice into this sharing of information about mindfulness, because really, if I could remove and make mindfulness disappear and science disappear and attention disappear and tips disappear, and we just had practices and we just spent the next 45 minutes doing some mindfulness practices, that would probably be the greatest bang for our buck. But to go back to Nestor's point, we might give up and move on, even though we find it at times to be interesting or pleasant or calming. And so part of our exploration of the content, the information about mindfulness, is meant to help us navigate through that. So maybe, just maybe, if you're someone who said, oh, I like it, I get it, I want to do it, but I just don't do it, something might shift. And I'm happy to answer questions to try to, have us navigate through that interesting terrain of things that we want to do, like eating well or exercising or getting a good night's sleep, that for some reason our intentions and our conduct don't always meet up. I'll share with you, and this is in one of the readings that you have, that I think mindfulness can help our intentions meet up with our conduct. So if we want to get a better night's sleep, if we want to get out and exercise, if we want to be kinder to ourselves and others, if we want to persevere and not procrastinate as much, that the mindfulness practice can be helpful to having us meet those that wisdom that we have for how we'd like to conduct ourselves, and maybe realizing some of the things that get in the way. But here we have it where we're taking a look at the gifts and challenges that we in the legal profession, and I think you'll, like, if you're like me, you'll relate to most, if not all of these, we carry to be able to anticipate problems. Many of you, I'd like to think myself, are able to anticipate problems. We can sort of think about what might happen on this particular contract that we're drafting, or this, document that's going to be the basis of some, partnership arrangement, whatever that might be. And we could anticipate problems, and our clients are looking to us to do just that. we're willing, maybe not looking forward to it, though some of us may be, to get into high conflict adversarial contests. We're willing to do that. You're hard pressed to go into the law and not know that you're moving into an adversarial domain. We tend to like to get things right, to be sort of a bit perfectionistic, and working on it and working on it and working on it. And our clients are interested in us actually turning out a really fine product, as well as our colleagues, as well as the judges that will be reading our work. And we're able to move into the space of a voluminous workload and take it on. So these are the gifts that we have. But these can also be challenges, because if we can anticipate problems, but we can't sort of turn off the anticipating of problems, we'll be on vacations, we'll be waking up in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, anticipating a problem. And oftentimes caught in feeling anxious and worried because the thought, the anticipation, the parade of horribles, the catastrophizing has taken hold. And we're not quite sure how to get out of that sort of quicksand. We move into high conflict adversarial terrain, and we can perceive threats. We can have it where we're always vigilant, waiting for the email to come or the phone call or the comment from the person of the shoe dropping. And that has us sort of in a heightened alert and alarm. We can have a perfectionism that really affects our mood. Something doesn't go so right. We learn that we made a mistake, and this can also lead in ways to rumination and to depression. And with the voluminous workload, we can feel overwhelmed. So my guess is that you all have a sense of this. And then, of course, when we put all these together, because it's not like just there's one day, one of these things, it's like every day there's all of these things, perhaps. We can really find ourselves with the time pressures and the demands of clients and judges and colleagues, et cetera, not to mention our larger life beyond the practice of law. We can really, and it can be helpful to regulate. It can be helpful to actually find a way of not losing these qualities that serve us and our clients so well, but being able to regulate and modulate them. But when we have all these pressures and all this stuff going on, and it's a dynamic process, we feel stressed. And we know this. Even this phrase, this image is itself a little stress-inducing. So in a moment, we'll do a mindfulness practice to sort of be an antidote in some ways. But first, something about stress, because it's important, I think, to understand that there's stress that is helpful to us. This is a very important psychological principle, a law, in fact, called the Yerkes-Dodson law. It's also known as the inverted U. It might be familiar to some of you. We have stress running across the horizontal plane at the bottom from low to high. You know those days where the stress is low, those days where the stress is high. Performance, low and high, you probably understand those variations as well. And there's actually, when the stress is low, the performance tends to be low, but as the stress picks up, and here we're talking about something impinging on our system. It could be the coffee we're drinking. It can be the thought that we're having that's getting us a little rattled. It could just be the momentum. So stress can take many forms, but we need stress. And we all know how sometimes we want to get pumped up, or we really got to get ourselves going, and our performance goes up to a point. And that's where we have optimum stress. But then if we keep drinking the coffee, or we keep worrying about the thing that may or may not ever happen, whatever that may be, and we all have our own situations that fall into this, the stress can keep going, and then all of a sudden our performance can drop. And we probably all know those moments where we're really in a flow state, things are really going well, and then we also know those moments where all of a sudden we're becoming overly agitated, a bit scattered, and whatever else that might show up for you as. Also, you might have it where you know what it's like to want to have a little bit more oomph. So we've got this unhelpful stress, which is sort of known as distress, and we've got this helpful stress, which is known as eustress. And in many ways, I want to suggest to you, we could actually draw upon mindfulness practices so that when we're on the eustress side, but not quite up at the top, we can actually draw upon mindfulness practices to get us moving, as well as other things like exercise and eating and doing a variety of other things that can be useful. And when we find ourselves And this is probably what has most of us interested in paying attention, because of course it's on this other side where our mental health declines, where we're more likely to engage in conduct that isn't as professional or civil, and maybe even traipses, even for a moment of not paying close enough attention, into the domain of unethical. And then perhaps even more importantly is, what do we do in that moment? Do we cover it up, or do we actually find a way to attend to it responsibly? And so it's that side of where it's the unhelpful distress that probably many of us who are interested in mindfulness, and many of us interested in bringing it into the law, are really focusing our attention. And the invitation is to see how it is that you can find yourselves in situations that historically have been challenging, to muster the energy or to muster the capacity to stay with it, or to optimize what you deliver and to dial it down a little bit through a mindfulness practice, or through things that we learn from practicing mindfulness. Okay, so with that, mindfulness. So what is mindfulness? Now here's a cute little bizarro comic from a good number of years ago. What do we want? Mindfulness. When do we want it? Now. And perhaps you see the humor in that, the paradox. But just to have a sense, when we say mindfulness, when I say mindfulness, it's talking about a quality, a state, a way of being present for the moments of our life and the ways we interact with each other, with qualities like being aware, being focused, grateful, patient, non-judgmental, relaxed, creative, courageous, equanimous. That's being able to ride through the ups and downs of a bumpy ride without bumping around more than the ride actually has in store for us. And to be able to take care along the way, or make wise decisions. To be resilient, to be generous and receptive and non-reactive and curious and compassionate. And you can layer on top those other attributes that you know when things are going well, when you're sort of delivering as a human being, as a friend, as a parent, as a child, as a partner, as somebody driving in traffic, in a way that is useful and helpful to things moving forward and feels good, because we are in that state. And we all have this. You don't need a mindfulness practice. In fact, we could remove the word mindfulness from this. We could call it awareness. We could call it being present. We could call it being grounded. You can call it whatever you want. But what's important is how it shows up and how we show up with it. And you don't need to be practicing mindfulness for this. You don't need to be doing necessarily anything, although journaling and being in nature, eating well, getting a good night's sleep and sleeping well, exercise, being with people in supportive relationships, engaging in various things for self-care, getting out in nature, being with your pet, journaling, prayer. There's a variety of things that all help to move us in this direction and sustain this. And you all have your go-tos, and they served you well, and it would be nice to remember those and reflect on those, because at different times in our life, the music that we used to play, or the art that we used to do, or the time we used to take just to get out and walk, or the vacation we used to take, we sometimes think we're too busy to do these very things that actually could serve as ways of optimizing us in the other moments of our life where we think we don't have enough time. And I say think and think because those might just be thoughts. I don't have enough time. I'll never get this done. I can't do that now. I'm sorry, no. And it might be that that's the case, but thoughts are not facts. And if we're not aware of the thoughts that we're having, then we're going to be just yanked along for the ride. So this is a way of saying the word mindfulness is broad, and you could even discard the word mindfulness in terms of what it's pointing to. But there are mindfulness practices, and we'll be doing one in just a moment. So in terms of a definition for mindfulness, here's Ruth King, and she suggests that with mindfulness practice, we learn how to get still and simply receive the present moment without preference. To simply receive the present moment without preference. John Kabat-Zinn, a very important leader of mindfulness, very much in the West, and the developer of a program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, which if you're not aware of, it's very helpful for anxiety. It's very helpful for managing pain. It's very helpful for managing life. It's called MBSR. That's sort of affectionately known by its letters, mindfulness-based stress reduction. An offshoot of that is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT. Very helpful, and a lot of important research on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and working with depression and depression relapse. And then there's mindfulness-based relapse prevention for working with relapsing with substances and addiction. So they're all very similar, and the practice that we'll do in a little bit, like a mindfulness program for just reducing stress or to be able to focus, it's the same fundamentals, but those different programs have slightly different conversation points and ways of applying it to those particular domains. Michael Yellowbird says whether it's mainstream or traditional cultural mindfulness practices, because these come from many traditions that we engage in, he reminds us that will change the function and structure of our brain for the better. It will increase our compassion, patience, creativity, emotional intelligence, and courage. Like he was looking at that diagram a moment ago with all the things going around the green circle. And so here what we have are just some takeaways for you that you might find of interesting, 3 slightly different but very much overlapping considerations of mindfulness, and how Ruth King is referring specifically to a mindfulness practice. John Kabat-Zinn is referring to mindfulness as the awareness that arises from paying attention in a particular way. And what we'll be doing in a moment is a mindfulness practice where we'll be paying attention in a particular way. And if we were to try to tease it apart, it would be on purpose, because it would be deliberate, to what's taking place in the present moment. And if I say, let's direct our attention to the breath or the sensations of the breath, well, guess where that breath is arising? It's arising in the present moment. And non-judgmentally, which is its own interesting conversation point that we'll get to. And Michael Yellowbird is reminding us of the fact that there's something about this practice of just sort of sitting. You don't have to be sitting. You can be walking, you can be talking, you can be doing a lot of things and practicing mindfulness, but its most traditional form, and the one that we'll explore in just a moment, will involve sitting, can change the function and structure of our brains for the better. And we'll look at some of the science in a moment on that. But first, let's do a practice. So let's bring ourselves into a posture that is upright and stable. For this short practice, we'll be doing 2, maybe 3 practices during our time together, so that you can walk away and either be reminded of or perhaps ask a question in a little bit because something comes up as you're thinking about this practice. And these practices will build on each other. So the first one will be relatively straightforward and probably somewhat familiar, but the second one will offer us a little bit more insight into what it is that we're doing when we're practicing mindfulness, as opposed to other types of meditative practices, as important and useful as they may be. So we bring ourselves into a posture that's upright and stable. Not rigid, but not slouched. As we lower or close our eyes, whichever you prefer, because we're cultivating this inner gaze. We've spent so much of our day, in all likelihood, looking out, assessing, anticipating, keeping track of. And so you can keep your eyes open because there's nothing about what we're cultivating, which is greater present moment awareness, that calls for the eyes to be closed. To the contrary, sometimes it's quite necessary that they be open, which is why we're practicing for the moments of our life when we're not practicing, because we're training our attention. And for those of you who forgot or you weren't paying attention at the time, that word attention matters for reasons that you probably remember. As we direct our attention to the sensations of the body sitting in the chair. You've been sitting probably in a chair or on a cushion for the better part of the last half hour. But perhaps you're noticing the sensations of where your body meets the chair. More aware. Not just the brain passively receiving it, but you're actually attending on purpose to those sensations. As we breathe, aware of the sensations of our hands resting one in the other, or on our lap, by our side. Aware of the feet. You're shining the flashlight of your attention where you choose. That's really remarkable. Now we're shining it to the sensations of where our feet make contact with the ground or our shoes or socks. And if you pay attention, you can feel what's always been fed up to the brain, but now you're aware in a more profoundly rich way of these sensations. Because we are, in many ways, coming to our senses with this practice. We can spend so much of the day lost in thought, worrying, anticipating, regretting. It could be useful movement of the mind. It could be, as it often is, unhelpful movement of the mind, largely unaware. So here we are, coming to our senses. Awareness descends into the body. And for those of you who are athletes or yogis or get out and jog or walk, you know what it is to be more embodied as we breathe. And for the next few moments, this practice will last perhaps a minute longer. For the next few moments, attend to the sensations of this precious breath as it flows through your body. You may know it at the nostrils as the air flows in and out. You may know it at the belly expanding and softening, riding along the wave of the breath. What's important is that you know it. And as best you can, you stay with it as we breathe. And in the next moment or two, with an awareness of doing so, lifting the gaze, opening the eyes. Alrighty, so for that relatively short practice, we directed our attention to the sensations of the breath with the intention to stay there. You'll notice that I didn't say take slower, deeper breaths. That would be like James Nestor's book, Breathe, and that would be manipulating the breath to try to achieve a slightly different state. That's also good to do in a mindfulness practice. So the next one we do, I'll begin with that, because that can help us sort of down-regulate a little bit, settle down a little bit. Heart rate drops off a little bit, blood pressure drops off a little bit, stress hormone cortisol drops off a little bit. But this first practice we did, I didn't include that because it's not fundamental to a mindfulness practice. It's nice to have. And I also didn't include an instruction that you probably did on your own at some point in time, but I'll make explicit in the next one because it gets really to the heart of the mindfulness project. So, couple things first of all. Since we just did a mindfulness practice, we could call that a breath awareness practice, a focused attention practice, though it was missing one key instruction. What's the difference between mindfulness and meditation? And we could call it mindfulness meditation. And is there a difference between mindfulness meditation and other types of meditation? So a simple way of sort of expounding on this is if you said to somebody, I'm interested in sports, that's like saying to somebody, I'm interested in meditation. To a person that only knows one sport, it's pretty clear. But to one who understands the nature of sports, it's like, oh, golf, tennis, cycling, baseball, which one? They're different. They exercise different muscles. They may lead us feeling differently after practicing them. They may serve different purposes. Meditation, there's many different types of meditation practices. Creative visualizations, transcendental meditation, fondly known as TM, gratitude practices, loving kindness practices, mantra practices, progressive muscle relaxation. And then there's mindfulness. And so at this stage in the game, know that they're different, just the way sports are different. And one of the perhaps biggest takeaways, now, if I were somebody who was teaching about one of these other practices, I probably would say, wait a minute, Scott, I don't agree with you 100% here. But I think what I'm saying is relatively fair, knowing that mindfulness really can run through everything that we're doing in life, including other practices. But when we practice creative visualization, for example, it's often to visualize some relaxing, soothing place, or visualize some environment in which we're maybe going to be engaging in. And in many ways, it's to change something. It's to change the state of what we're experiencing, or to change the way we're going to deliver on something. More often than not, it's to feel calmer, steadier, more relaxed, more comfortable, more loving, more kind, more grateful, whatever it may be, which is wonderful. If you find the practices that serve those domains, wonderful. I do. Mindfulness, though, meditation, mindfulness practices are a little bit more oriented towards not changing the way we're feeling, not changing the state of our physiological arousal, for example. It may change through the practice, but it's more about being aware of what we're experiencing, being resilient in the face of what we're experiencing, than it is changing something about our experience. Remember back to Jon Kabat-Zinn, for example, paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, to what's taking place in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. There's nothing in there that's saying, and to change the way we're feeling or to feel more calm. Although for reasons that I'll get into in just a moment or two, it does tend, for very good reasons, to effectuate a calmer, steadier state, but not because we're adding something to our experience. In some ways, it might be because we're clarifying and cleaning away aspects of our experience. And importantly, mindfulness meditation is not emptying the mind. We're not emptying the mind of thoughts. We're really not. We're not trying to change our thoughts. We're not trying to have better thoughts. That gets to what I just spoke to a few moments ago. It's not a panacea. It's my experience. It's not like, oh my God, remember Dan Harris's book, 10% Happier. It's not a religion, paying attention in a particular way on purpose to what's taking place in the present moment. It's not a Band-Aid. It's not meant to just sort of cover something up or mask something. And it also may not be for everyone. So, so let's continue our journey with just a little bit of the science. We just did a practice. We're going to do a practice in a few moments. But let's just touch on this underlying science. So just to get a sense of how in 2002, when Harvard Negotiation Law Review came out with that issue following their symposium, there wasn't a whole lot out there with mindfulness, but you could see how there's a little bit of an uptick. Things were beginning to happen 20 years ago in terms of research. And now we see that every year now there's a steady supply of 800 to 1,000 and now beyond studies. So that's one thing to take note of. Another, though, is this. This is an important book that came out with Daniel Goleman, who, if you're familiar with emotional intelligence, the grandparent of emotional intelligence, Richard Davidson, one of the leading neuroscientists, called Altered Traits. Remember, changes to the structure and function of our brain? We're not talking about changing our state for a few moments, which a relaxation practice can be helpful for doing. We're talking about changing something more fundamental as the ways we relate to our experience. So there is a greater resilience. There is a greater capacity to catch ourselves when we're lost in mind wandering, as we'll make explicit in the next practice. But I share this with you because it's a good book if you're interested, how science reveals how meditation changes your mind, body, and brain and body. But also they say, yeah, there's 6,000, 7,000 science articles out there, but many of them are not as have the rigors that really are needed to be able to make bold statements. Plus, 50, 60 years ago, if somebody said to you, oh, you should exercise, it's good for your heart, you'll have less cardiovascular disease, there was big debate on that. But now there's hundreds of thousands of studies, and we just know that that's the case. I think this is where we're going with mindfulness practices, but also know that you're the subject, you're the experimenter. When you sit and practice, know this for yourself, one way or the other. Don't take what word I'm saying for it. And don't even, for that matter, take the word of these science reports, but they might be useful data. They might be of interest. So these I took from a website called Science Daily. It does a nice job reporting on science of all sorts. And I think it does a good job with these 1-2 page, for the lay public, understanding what the research is finding. You can then, of course, importantly, look at the underlying research to really get a clearer understanding of where something might be hyped or slightly misarticulated. But I broke these into 3 domains for you. One is the cognitive benefits, another is the emotional benefits, and the third is physical health benefits. So in the cognitive benefits domain, we talked about changes to the structure. Here it is, 2005, landmark study by Sarah Lazar at Harvard. Increased cortical thickness. The cortex of our brain as we age gets thinner. And what Sarah and her colleagues found was that the more people practice mindfulness meditation, just like the one we did over years and years and years, the less there was thicker areas of certain parts of the brain associated with executive functioning, concentration, focus, and also that the thinning of the cortex, which is a natural part of aging, but will affect information processing and other cognitive faculties, that there was a less thinning of the cortex. So that was a very important, groundbreaking study. But then we see other studies, and there's many more than just this, on changes to the brain's physical structure. We have in green, mindfulness training can improve cognitive performance in U.S. Special Operations Forces. I happen to put that in green because that's the one that we did. That was written up in the New York Times as one example. You've also got Forever Young. Meditation might slow the age-related loss of gray matter in the brain. I touched on that, and there's many other findings of other areas as well. Turning down the volume on distractions. That's probably very practical and seems like a very useful one because we're so readily distracted by things. And then once we're distracted, off we can go. Improve creative thinking. The emotional benefits for depression and anxiety, I touched on that. We'll look at that in a little more depth in just a moment. Anxiety, changes to the structure of the brain associated with things like fear and anxiety. And then the health benefits, immune function, inflammation, improved sleep. I mean, the list does go on, but it isn't a panacea. And these findings aren't saying that everything gets better and everything's perfect, but there are meaningful changes that we can make to things as fundamental as our neuroanatomy, not to mention our physical health with things like immune functioning and the inflammatory response. So there's something I think here. I know it from my own direct experience. So do many others. When I began practicing mindfulness 30 years ago, none of this research was out. So you just knew it. But it's hugely helpful to have research that can also allow us to refine it. What can be useful, what types of practices, for how long, for what purposes, et cetera. And that's where the science is pointing us. That meta-analysis on the top right found that with 47 studies combined, moderate evidence for improvements in anxiety and depression, lower pain. We could talk maybe offline, you're all welcome to contact me, how mindfulness might be helpful for pain. But importantly, effects comparable to what would be expected from the use of an antidepressant in a primary care population, but without the associated toxicities. This is not a call to jettison your medication, to the contrary, but it is a reminder that there's something here that can be a very important complement to the ways that we take care of ourselves. And then that piece that was in the New York Times, the results suggest that short form mindfulness trainings, like the one we're going to do in just a moment, which will have a little bit more of that instruction, when delivered over a 4-week delivery schedule, may be an effective cognitive training tool in elite military cohorts, or perhaps you could say elite legal professionals. All right, so the science points us to attention. At the beginning, when I said, let's direct our attention to the sensations of the breath, we're really shining the flashlight of our attention. And we have this flashlight that we can shine in certain directions, and where our attention goes, so much of our brain follows, so much of the neural real estate follows, because if we're paying attention to it, it must be important. But so often our attention flies off and we don't even know where it is. This is where the mindfulness practices can be so helpful, because when your mind wanders off into the future and you start worrying about things that may or may not ever happen, good luck. And if you don't even realize you're lost in that thought, oh, the cascade of physiological shifts and anxiety and heart palpitations and tension that will follow when we're not even aware of where we are. A very important study that came out of Harvard by Matt Killingsworth and Dan Gilbert found that the mind wanders. This flashlight just wanders off about 47% of the time. Whose flashlight is it? It's your flashlight. It's wandering off. The flashlight makes a wonderful servant. It makes a terrible master. Be in charge of your flashlight. Be in charge of your cell phone. Be in charge of your technologies. And this is a technology that we're exploring here, perhaps the most powerful and consequential technology of all. That research also found that while the mind wanders off as much as 47% of the time, when it wanders, we tend to move into states of mind and thoughtful processing that is a source of unhappiness. The study that was published in the very prestigious journal Science was titled "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." So our attention is really fundamental to so much of this. That was why in that first piece, how the science of mindfulness can improve your attention and lift your mood. So a couple of things, and then we'll do another practice, and then I'll share a little image with you, and then we'll close. And by the way, I write for, and this is some of the readings you have, if you're not already familiar, at the Florida Bar Journal News every month, the Mindful Lawyer column. This comes from one of the columns from about a year ago, the 9 Principles of Attention, and also for ABA Journal, the GP Solo, every other month, the Mindfulness 101. And I think some of the readings came from there as well. So we'll just tend to 4 of these. 1, attention needs an object. That's why we say something like, direct your attention to the breath. It's good to anchor your attention, because if your attention isn't anchored and you're not able to follow it when it flies off, who knows where it will go. Attention follows directions. In a moment when we do a practice, I'll say, direct your attention to the sensations of your breath, and you will. For how long? Because attention can be fickle and it wanders, and that is its nature 47% of the time. And it's not all problematic. Where do aha moments and creativity and great ideas and seeing possibilities come from, if not a mind at play? But number 9, attention is trainable. Cognitive neuroscientists call the mindfulness practices push-ups for the brain, exercising the muscle of attention. So with that, let's do a mindfulness practice. This one will be like the one we just did. It'll be sort of a takeaway practice, and I'll add a little information to it, and then we'll look at an illustration to help put it together in a tractable way that you might find useful later today or tomorrow. So we bring ourselves into a posture that is upright and stable. This is our closing practice. It'll be about 3.5 minutes. As we lower or close our eyes, whichever you prefer, as we direct our attention, as we shine the flashlight of our attention, taking control of our attention. Who knows where it was a minute and a half ago, but now you sort of do know where it is, don't you? Attending to the sensations of the breath flowing through the body as we take 3 slower, deeper breaths. Breathing in and breathing out. Breathing in a little slower, a little deeper than you normally would. And breathing out, a slower, steady, tempered out breath. It can be helpful sometimes as if you're blowing through a straw. Breathing in and breathing out. And those 3 slower, deeper breaths, which could, in the middle of a hearing or getting ready to walk into a meeting or just getting home or putting aside the work of the day, can be a meaningful shift, just a subtle shift with a real physiological movement. And we begin the practice with that because it's helpful to see things more clearly, to notice where your mind is if we're feeling a little calmer, even if just a little. But then we allow our breathing to resume its natural pacing and rhythm, whatever that may be. If you're feeling worried about something, your breathing will probably be a little shallower. If you're tired, it'll be a little sluggish. If you're really calm and at ease, it'll be smooth and silky. Remember, non-judgmentally. The breath is what the breath is. It's always changing. What we're interested in doing now is directing our attention to the sensations of the breath, which means you locate it somewhere. It's an object. Remember, attention likes an object. Give it an object. Attention follows directions. Tell it where to go. Attention is fickle. And so you will notice, if you haven't already, that your mind will wander again and again and again. That's fine. Truly, that's fine. We're interested in being aware of when the mind begins to or is wandering. And so here's that additional instruction. When you notice that your mind has wandered, in that moment of mindful awareness, you have realized that you've forgotten where you were. Your intention was lost. In that moment of realization, to gently reestablish your intention to return to the sensations of the breath flowing through the body. As we breathe. And in many ways, what we're doing with this practice, it yes can be helpful for feeling a little calmer. In many ways, because our attention isn't given as much room to roam. It's anchored. And when it does begin to roam, we realize it. And before it can get lost, we bring it back. But this isn't a practice about not wandering, and it's not a practice about feeling nothing but calm. It's a practice about being aware when the mind wanders. It's good to know where the mind is. And then it's good to be able to then make a decision of what to do with that information. So this is really a practice in being more aware of the activity of the mind by practicing noticing, which is why the second CLE code, and it's not fair to give it to you in the middle of a practice, but why not, is awareness. Try not to write it down in the middle of the practice. I'll say it again. To be aware, because we've been exploring attention, the narrowing of our focus, and awareness, holding that larger container of what's taking place. Because in court, we want to have both. In a meeting, we want to have both. We want to narrow with a broad field of awareness as we breathe. When you're ready in the next moment or two, with the few minutes we have remaining, to lift the gaze, open the eyes. As we take a look at this parting, at this image as a parting consideration. This is the landscape of the mind, the attractive nuisance, I sometimes call it. If you remember those torts cases with those boys who wandered off on that beautiful day and took a dive and a swim in that great pool of cool water, but very tragically it was toxic and they passed away. It was an attractive nuisance. And so running through the center of this landscape of the mind is the freeway of flow. You'll see our little cars with our little attention headlamps, where we're focused and purposeful and productive and creative and clear of mind and connected and courageous. And we all know these moments. This is like what surrounds the big green circle from the beginning. These are the attributes of what it is to be a human being who's in a good place. And we all can find ourselves here. Wouldn't it be nice to find ourselves there more often and to reestablish them? And then, oh, the places that we can go. We're going over the little bridge, and before you know it, there's Rumination Road, and we begin to think about something that didn't go so well. And before we know it, we're looping around it, and whoosh, we're in the river of regrets, swept away. The mindfulness invitation is, but wait a minute, what if we realize, oh, I'm beginning to think about yesterday's or last week's or last year's, whatever. Let me come back to the breath, which in many ways is on the way to the freeway of flow. Or we make it past Rumination Road and there's that warning sign, but oh, before we know it, we're lost in the valley of fear. Or any of these places. By the way, I created this about 15 years ago. I know all of these places, and after 30 years of practice, my parting words are to you that I still know these places. But I probably, for me, spend a little less time when I'm there. I probably realize a little sooner where I'm going. And that's an invitation that's available to all of us by noticing the activity of the mind and being able to redirect our attention. There's that roller coaster of emotion, the ups and the downs, and in many ways, life is a roller coaster of ups and downs, the joys and the sorrows, but it doesn't have to be so much of a ride. Can we ride the roller coaster of life that's actually presented us? Moments of happiness, moments of sadness, moments of joy, moments of despair, seeing them for what they are, and knowing that we were made for this life, we were made for these times, and we have others to help us through, just as we can help others. So I share this with you, and you're welcome to take a little snapshot of it if you'd like, because at times when we're feeling out of sorts, agitated, uncomfortable for whatever reason, we could say, where am I? Where am I? And we go, oh, there I am. And there's a saying, to name it is to tame it. To be able to point to it, and if you don't see it, write it in, is to shift and to pivot to a more aware, present, moment-oriented state of where we find ourselves. It's one thing to be lost in anger, just an angry, 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 or anxious, anxious, anxious person in that moment. It's a very different thing to go, oh, there's anger. Oh, there's anxiety. There's that thought. And to be able to become more skillful at finding our way back to a steadier state. And the mindfulness practices, and we've just done one together, this focused attention practice, is one of the methodologies for training that very capacity. And so with that, we are at time. I appreciate very much the invitation from Nelson Mullins to present and to share this information with you. I hope that our paths will cross. You're always welcome to reach out to me with any questions. Melissa, again, thank you for setting this in motion. Ben, I appreciate all the time and energy that you spent, Clara, to have us technologically get ready for this. And I wish you all a good holiday weekend and much joy and satisfaction in your life in the law and your life, which is a gift, as we all know, and perhaps have come to know especially so in these trying and interesting times.
Thank you very much, Scott. That was truly wonderful. Just being mindful of everyone's time, that it is 5 p.m. We will conclude the CLE. If you'd like any other information regarding Scott and the mindfulness program he runs, you can find him online. He has his website, scottrogers.com. Additionally, you all will be receiving an email later today with information to input your CLE credits. Have a great weekend, everyone. And Scott, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.